We are in Nehemiah 12. And so, you know, it'd be very easy to jump over this chapter and just say, hey, let's go to chapter 13. But when I read this chapter, I saw several things that I thought, no, this needs to be brought up. You know, sometimes some of the messages that I present are designed for you to have a faith handle, like some of the nitro pills that Dr. Scott taught on. There are messages I've delivered that are how to keep holding on when times get tough, but there are also messages that I must present that are things about learning God's Word that don't necessarily make you feel like, okay, I can go another week, but they give you a better understanding of a passage or a chapter you might have just passed by. We saw that last week with chapter 11 with a list of a whole bunch of dry, hard-to-pronounce names, right? So here we are in chapter 12, and much like last week, this chapter contains a long list of names. However, these are the names of priests and Levites from two different periods. And you might think, why would you want to know that? I'm going to read through the chapter momentarily, but the question is, why would you want to know that? Because knowing that there are two periods being listed of priests and Levites helps us to understand some insight into the post-exilic priestly line and its services, how certain things changed. And to understand that, let me just take a sidebar for a minute. Let's just step away from all this for a second. To understand, when we talk about the Levites and the priests, you have to go back. You've got to go back, way, way back to the book of Genesis. That is the product that came out of Leah and Jacob in the process of building the house of Israel, as he surely did. Handmaids, wives, you name it, the whole enchilada. But you've got to go back to Leah and know that that was out of that relationship. And in terms of a priestly line, was not really integrated as a hereditary or passed on through the generations until you get to the time of Aaron. Now, recorded for us. I'm strictly speaking of what's recorded for us. So aside from it being a patronymical title, aside from it denoting the descendants of Levi, there's also some things that as we get to know the history of these Levites, they, under Aaron, received specific work for the tabernacle. And if you remember, there were three groups specifically out of when they moved the tabernacle, three groups, one on the south, one on the north, and one on the west, the Kohathites, the Merarites, and the Gershonites. So those three groups comprised of groups of people who would be responsible for certain tasks concerning the tabernacle. And you might say, what does this have to do with this passage? Well, this passage has to do with the list of priests and Levites. And if you don't know what those responsibilities were originally, it's going to be hard to understand why is this even here? Because that's the first question I asked when I started studying this chapter. Why is this even here? My thinking, and it's merely a hypothesis. I always tell you when it's something I've speculated versus a factual basis, but I speculate that this chapter was added slightly later. I do not believe that it was in this setting, and I'll give you some reasons why. It doesn't change or break anything, because if it was added perhaps within 40 years, if it was, within 40 or so years of of the book being completed. You might say, why are you saying that? I'll tell you, be patient. But we know that the tabernacle back there, God spoke to Moses and said, build me a tabernacle, called the people to build. There were certain people that were gifted to build it, and then there were people who would perform the functions, and that's where we go back to Aaron and the sons of Aaron. That begins a passed on, hereditary, if you will, the sons of Aaron, and that whole line of priesthood. Now, it's very interesting when you follow the history of the tabernacle. We know that they moved that tent 40 years in the wilderness, and after they enter the promised land under Joshua, there's a whole bunch of dynamics that will happen, so that by the time you get to King David's time, David's lament, King David's lament, is that God doesn't have a house. David, who is now king, is living in a palace, and his lament is that God's ark, where God's presence would be, doesn't have a place to reside. And it's in his heart to build a house for God. And if you're following the line of everything that's happened with the priesthood, when the kingdoms divide, that is after Solomon's death in 930, we still have the temple, and the services of the Levites are going to be broken up. They are not going to be serving in the same capacity. So that by the time the people are carried away in captivity and they come back, it's going to be a wild card toss-up if they will even know what those duties were, because A, back in the beginning of the institution of the Levites, they served the purpose of the portable house of God, the tabernacle, and with the institution of the temple that was placed in David's heart and built under Solomon, his son, David, not Solomon, assigns new duties to the Levites. That's in 1 Chronicles, because there's nothing more for them to carry anymore. You remember, part of these three groups I described was, do you remember having to roll up and take care of each piece of furniture, and a very laborious thing to move the tabernacle? Now you've got a whole bunch of people who are no longer doing this. Why? Because God has a house that is not moving anymore. So the question of how these people would have understood the Levites and the priesthood was my first kind of head scratcher. Like, we must investigate this. So I'll come back to the Levites and their function momentarily. I would like to get into the chapter, and I'll say a few words in passing so we can see what we are looking at here. So Nehemiah 12. Now these are the priests and the Levites that went up with Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, and Joshua. So we know one thing. Nehemiah 12, verses 1 through 7, represent Joshua the high priest and the men that came with him. And if you remember, some of you listen to Dr. Scott teach in Ezra, some of you have read through the book of Ezra. Ezra really had a hard time mustering up Levites. If you remember, he could only find 38, and he had to use 220 Nethinims, the servants of the temple, to make up for the difference of the missing Levites. So it's a very small list, and the list goes as follows: Sariah, Jeremiah, Ezra, Amariah, Maluch, Hattish, Shechaniah, Rehum, Meremoth, Iddo, Genetho, Abijah, Miamin, Maadiah, Bilgah, Shemaiah, and Joarib, Jediah, Salu, Amok, Hilkiah, Jediah. These were the chief priests and of their brethren in the days of Joshua. That's the first list. This is a list of people that came in that first wave. Now, the second list will occur beginning at the 12th verse. So let me read through. Moreover, the Levites, Joshua, Buni, Kadmiel, Sherebiah, Judah, and Mattaniah, which was over the thanksgiving, he and his brethren. This guy's name is just great. Also, Bakbukiah. Imagine having a name like that. Bakbukiah. And Uni. Their brethren were over against them in the watches. And Joshua begat, this is a very strange section here. Joshua begat Joachim, Joachim begat Elishib, Elishib begat Joiada, Joiada begat Jonathan, Jonathan begat Jaddua. And in the days of Joachim were priests, the chief of the fathers of Sariah, Moriah, Jeremiah, Hananiah, of Ezra. Now we're beginning a new list. So in the days of Joachim is the second priest following Joshua. There's a secondary list here. And these were Sariah, Moriah, Jeremiah, Hananiah, Ezra, Meshullam of Amariah, Johanan, Melchu, which, by the way, is the same name as in 12:2, Meluch, same name, Jonathan of Shabniah, Joseph of Haram, Adnah. So you've got all these names, but I want you to see the repetition of at least one name here. There's many that repeat, but Abijah is there twice, in 12:4 and in 12:17. Now, I don't want anybody to think that this is part of my message. It's just a sidebar. Sometimes things that are added at a later time, or even if this was the original part of the body of work, are there for a reason. I made a list, which please don't ask me for because it's my chicken scratch. This is the list of names that occur in 1 through 7, and this is the list of names that occurs in 12 through 21. And what I found was that, without a doubt, there are some scribal errors where names, you can know they're the same names, because we're talking about houses, the household of, the household of. So the names would not have changed. The only thing that's happened here is in Nehemiah 12, 1 through 7, if we do not count Joshua, there would be 22 names on this list and 2 names short of the 24 names that are in 1 Chronicles 24 of the courses of the priests. Why is this important? Because it tells me if somebody was just merely copying 1 Chronicles 24 and inserting it into here, into this chapter, they would have copied it exactly. Now, there's many people that say, well, when there's discrepancies like that, doesn't it take away from the verity of Scripture? In my opinion, it adds to it, because if we're just talking about people making up things, they could have just copied it. But instead, we have a list. The first list is short 2 people if you do not include the high priest. The second list is short 3 people, 3 names, if you don't include Jehoiakim, the high priest. But the consistent names, and there are consistent names, there are at least 50% of the names are consistent. The 2 groups, as you can see, they look the same. You've got Sariah, Jeremiah, Ezra, Amariah, Maluch, which is Maluchi, or some other version, it's the same name. Shechaniah, which we know scribally must be Shebniah. And, for example, Hattush, the name is missing there, which I believe is a scribal error. But there's one name that is in both cases. And we know that this name is important. Remember, this is the last organized list of things that we will see. Then comes the prophet Malachi that essentially closes the canon. So this is the last picture you're going to get of, forgive me, organized religion in Jerusalem. And it's as though the writer of this, by the way, I'm going to insist on saying, did not copy 1 Chronicles 24, where David's original list is listed of the 24 courses of the priest, of which Abijah is listed in there as number 8. And that name, Abijah, helps us to trace the birth of Jesus Christ. While there's a whole world of people, it's not Christmas time now, so, just relax. I feel like there's still stress in the air here. Some people get very uptight. You hear people saying, put Jesus, put Christ back into Christmas. He's the reason for the season. Well, if you're studying the Bible, you realize that there's a glaring problem with that. And I've told you this before. Zechariah, in the opening of Luke's Gospel, says that he was serving under the course of Abiah, which is Abijah. That is the 8th course. And we know that that course falls in the week of Sivan, the equivalent somewhere in May/June, because our calendar months don't quite work out. And it says that after he completed his service in the temple, he went home and serviced his wife, right? And they conceived. I'm just saying, the Lord said, you're going to have a child. It wasn't a miracle conception. They did it the old-fashioned way. And 9 months later, John the Baptist is born. And we know that John the Baptist is 6 months older than our Lord, born 6 months. So that difference right there, if you calculate the 2 times that Zacharias would have served, both in the month of Sivan, that is, as I said, approximating the date somewhere to be around May. I did the calculations just to make sure when my brain went that I wouldn't be too far ahead. If it happened during the first course, then we could say it like this. First course, the service would have been around May or June, the 8th week from the beginning of Nisan, which is the beginning of April. His second course would have occurred in the 35th week, which would be equivalent to Kislev, November, December. In any case, if you count up either, you do not and cannot arrive at 6 months later, the birth of Christ. Neither one of those dates gets you to December. I wish I could put that on a billboard for somebody to actually say, could you take the time to calculate this? Because I really want to celebrate somebody's birthday, but you know, if it was me, I've told you, I'd get a little tired if you kept calling me every day and say, happy birthday, Pastor. Well, it's not my birthday yet. You know, it's wonderful that you remembered me, but you know, if you're going to remember me aright. So these names are not in here just a bunch of names. There are other prominent features of this passage. I simply wanted to show you that there's two lists of names in here, and remarkably, Abijah's repeated. It's not that we're repeating a person twice. These are priests, heads of priests, names of families occurring, which will reoccur. And all of this is the fact that David, it all comes back to David, and I'll show you why in a minute, but this all comes back to him, to King David. Because as it was put in his heart to build a house for the Lord, and the word that came back from the Lord is, no, you have shed too much blood. You will not build the house, but I will build you a house, referring to he and the people of him, speaking, eventually looking to Christ, but your son Solomon will build it. So it is in the 23rd, 24th, 25th, 1 Chronicles 23 through 29, we see David has reorganized and repurposed many of the Levitical services. And they have no longer the same purpose they did previously when they were carrying around the tabernacle. Think of it this way. I mean, it seems to be self-evident, but there's many people, I'm sure, in the sound of my voice who do not know the degree of care for each item when they moved. For some people, actually, they removed the curtains and they folded up the curtains, and some people were in charge of the plates and the cups and the utensils. And every person was responsible for something. So now you have a whole bunch of people who are essentially out of work. Boy, I could make a political comment right there, but I won't. See, that's why I have to use restrain. So David repurposed, essentially, the Levites, and they end up having a different type of responsibility. And this is the miracle of this chapter. We can easily forget, yes, they came back, these people in Nehemiah's book, in Ezra's book, they came back from captivity, they found the book of the law, they read it, they wept, they began to try and order their lives accordingly. What we do not know is whether or not they had access to know what exactly happened when David reorganized everything. So can you imagine what it would be like if they were doing all of this? Let's go back to Ezra, and he's looking for people to come who are of that Levitical realm, and he can only find 38. There are not enough people. So you're going to have to do one of two things. You're going to have to find the people, or you're going to have to get the people and bring them into that responsibility. So this chapter is kind of remarkable because what it's doing is it's showing you not only the preservation of the people and their courses, because these courses would be carried on through Malachi, through even the interruptions of the intertestamental period, right straight through to the time of Christ. And that is where I was talking about the opening chapter of Luke, which talks about Zechariah serving in Abijah's course. So it's almost like saying these lines here are preserved. If it's not enough to read it in 1 Chronicles 24, you'll read it twice here, as if God's saying, can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? How about now? So it's repeated there for a reason. And then we move on. Verse 22, the Levites in the days of Eliashib, Joiada, Johanan, Jaddua, were recorded chief of the fathers, also the priest, to the reign of Darius the Persian. The sons of Levi, the chief of the fathers, were written in the book of the Chronicles, even until the days of Johanan, the son of Eliashib, the chief of the Levites. And here we go again. Hashabiah, Sherebiah, and Joshua the son of Kadmiel with their brethren over against them. Second time we're hearing this, to praise and to give thanks. Isn't that what it said at the top of verse 8? These were gathered to give thanks, thanksgiving, he and his brethren. Again, to praise and give thanks according to the commandment of David, the man of God, warred over against ward. Now I want you to just, I'll come back to this verse in a minute, but I want you to see something very relevant. Somebody in here, whether it was somebody whose design and it was within the book or added later, had to know about how David repurposed the Levites. Now, bear with me, because this is such a staggering concept. They were in captivity. Everything ceased while they were in captivity. So how did they know this? They didn't have like now where you can go and buy a Bible anywhere. How did they know this? Verse 25, Mattaniah and Bakbukiah and Obadiah, Meshullam, Talmon, Akub were porters. Keeping the ward, they were gatekeepers at the threshold of the gates. These were in the days of Jehoiakim, the son of Joshua, the son of Jozadak, in the days of Nehemiah, the governor, and Ezra, the priest, the scribe. Now, I've just described all the people, pretty much. There'll be a few others, but here's the wonderful thing. What's about to happen is all the work of the building of the walls, we studied this, the dedication is about to occur. And the key thing that people have asked is, why did the writer of this book wait so long? Now, that's why I said to you, it's my impression there's a couple of things in here that don't necessarily fit. But had you not had the information from 12:1 through to 26, you might be trying to think, well, why are the Levites so important here? What's the big deal about these Levites? Who cares about them? What's the big deal, right? You wouldn't know. And the reason I believe this was added later, what I just read to you, is to make sure that whoever was going to read in verse 27 could understand the place that the Levites now held was for praise and worship. They had other duties still. You'll read on how they purified the people themselves, the people, the walls, and the gates. But their main task right here is going to be to give thanks and praise. So think about that for a minute. Had you not known that, the whole context of this changes. At the dedication of the wall of Jerusalem, they sought the Levites out of all their places to bring them to Jerusalem to keep the dedication with gladness, both with thanksgiving and with singing, with cymbals, psalteries, and with harps. And the sons of the singers gathered themselves together, both out of the plain country round about Jerusalem and from the villages of Netophathi, also from the house of Gilgal and out of the fields of Jeba and Asmaveth. The singers had builded them villages round about Jerusalem. Here we go again. And the priests and the Levites purified themselves, purified the people, the gates, and the wall. That was one of their tasks. So we're about to have this grand celebration, a celebration like has been never seen before and will never be seen again in this book. And it starts with these people. Remember back there in chapter 11, reoccupying, populating the city. People who willingly gave themselves. Now we have the purification of the people, the gates, the walls by the Levites and the priests. And then it says, then I brought, we have a first shift back to first person, then I. All of this time it's been an editorial or a narrative. This is the first time it goes back to, then I brought up the princes of Judah upon the wall, and appointed two great, lots of italics here, companies of them that gave thanks, whereof one went to the right hand upon the wall toward the dung gate. Now, here we go, and I determined that I wouldn't do this freehand, and I thought I would have time to come out here and make a better sketch, but I think we won't have time, and I'll have to do it freehand. So here we go. If you remember, my tablet is at the wrong angle, and forgive me, because I'm not going to draw the gates. I'm going to draw an approximate, whatever that looks like. It's supposed to look like a foot. Okay, let's put some gates in. Let's put some gates in here. So, and yeah, probably need this space right here. There's a wall. Thank goodness for the ability to erase. All right? So I want you to think about this, because otherwise, if you don't visualize this, you're going to lose the whole thing. You've got two groups of people. The princes of Judah upon the wall, and appointed two companies. One went to the right hand toward the dung gate. And we know the dung gate, thankfully, is at the bottom. I'm glad it's not at the top, it's at the bottom. So we know one thing. When it says they went to the right hand, we know that there is a group of people. They were not in the inside. They were actually on the outside. And we know that because it says they went to the right hand. So there's a whole procession of people headed down this way. That's one group of people. And after them went Hoshea and half the princes of Judah, and Azariah, Ezra, Meshullam, Judah, Benjamin, Shemaiah, Jeremiah, and certain of the priests with sons with trumpets, namely Zechariah, the son of Jonathan, the son of Shemaiah, the son of Mattaniah, the son of Micaiah, the son of Zachar, the son of Asaph, Holy Toledo. His brethren, Shemaiah, Azriel, Gilaleh, wow, Ma'ai, Nathaniel, Judah, Hanani, with the musical instruments of David, the man of God, and Ezra the scribe before them. Now, you have one group of people that is, as I just showed you, going down this way. Now, if you talk to or you read any archaeology things, they'll say, well, the wall couldn't have been big enough for them to be on the wall. I don't know. All I know is they went that way. That's one group of people, all right? That's all I know. And it says, verse 37, at the fountain gate, which was over against them, they went up by the stairs of the city of David, at the going up of the wall, above the house of David, even unto the water gate eastward. So we know that that is this general area. Why? Because this whole area here, somewhere from this point and slightly south of this, on a map, is what is referred to in 1 Chronicles 11 as Jebus, which was the Jebusite fortress, which then David seizes and it becomes City of David, Jerusalem. So we know that they went down and around, and they're going to work their way up somewhere in here. They may enter, but I think truly they probably went all the way outside. This one group, and you can imagine the great procession of people and the great regalia of everything. And it says, the other company of them that gave thanks went over against them, and I after them, and half the people upon the wall from beyond the tower of the furnaces, even unto the broad wall, and from above the gate of Ephraim, and above the old gate, and above the fish gate, and the tower of Hananiel, and the tower of Mia, even unto the sheep gate, and they stood still in the prison gate. That means there's another group of people that went this way. So another group of people that went this way, and these people are heading this way, and they're all going to come in right about here, and they're all going to enter in and come into the temple, which is exactly what they did. So I want you to, it's a terrible drawing, I'm sorry, forgive my drawing. It looks like somebody's just having a bad time. They can't, maybe it's a chicken that was walking around somewhere, I don't know. But what I want you to envision now, I've given you the outline of the city. I want you to imagine two great processionals splitting up and making their way around the walls that they had worked to erect, the walls that they had labored, the walls that they were told could not, the walls that they had now consecrated and now they are in the process of dedicating. They're walking around. Imagine these great processions, and they will meet in the house. So stood the two companies of them that gave thanks in the house of God. They're now in the temple. They're now all in here. Somehow in my little, they all fit in the little box. They're all in here. I and half the rulers with me. And the priest, Eliakim, Messaniah, all the people, I'm just going to pass over the names. And the singers sang aloud with Jezreiah, the overseer. Also that day they offered great sacrifices and rejoiced, for God had made them rejoice with great joy. The wives also and the children rejoiced. It means the women and the children were not left out of this celebration. Everybody was rejoicing, so that the joy of Jerusalem was heard even afar off. I'm going to read because there's only a few verses left in the chapter. And at that time were some appointed over the chambers for the treasures, for the offerings, for the first fruits, and for the tithes, to gather them out of the fields of the cities, the portions of the law, for the priests and the Levites. For Judah rejoiced for the priests and for the Levites that waited. Both singers and the porters, the gatekeepers, kept the word of their God and the word of the purification according to the commandment of David and Solomon his son. For in the days of David and Asaph of old, there were chief of the singers and songs of praise and thanksgiving unto God. And all Israel in the days of Zerubbabel and in the days of Nehemiah gave the portions of the singers and the gatekeepers every day his portion, and they sanctified holy things unto the Levites, and the Levites sanctified them unto the children of Aaron. Now, this is what's remarkable. In this chapter should be broken into two parts. The cataloging of the priests and the Levites, the first bunch and the second bunch, which tells you that the heads of the families were still important. And then this whole ceremony, this whole procession around the city. And if there are a few thoughts I want to glean before I actually get to where I need to go, let me just say this. You'll find in this chapter, people are rejoicing at the dedication of the walls, the house of God. And along with that rejoicing, the word thanksgiving, thanks, praise and thanks to God, thanks with singing, all of that is coupled with something, giving. On that day they gave. Now, when people talk about this is not my message, although it could be, but it's not. When people talk about worship, they think that worship can only mean, if everybody's down on their knees and everybody's doing the sign of something and whatever it is they're doing, and this must be worship because this looks holy. But in reality, if you read what is being said here, there could be no greater act than the act of the people. It says the Levites purified the people themselves, the people, the walls and the gates. That is consecration, setting apartness, if you will, to the service of God, and all the rejoicing, the grand procession that circled the walls to come into the temple. And in this time, while there's all this praise and thanksgiving, there's also lots of praise and thanksgiving of things being given. So when somebody says to you, I don't know about that, all you need to do is look at this, and this is the prototype of what celebration should be like when people come into the house of God. Now, they were celebrating the stones that they had erected or the stones that they had replaced. The New Testament talks about us being lively stones, living stones, and we are the house of God. God takes up his abode in us. They were celebrating the habitation of God and God's people. And if all of that's not enough, because I said there's so much in this chapter, and I really just wanted to kind of, like one fell swoop, just get it and go through it. The one thing that stuck out at me the most is that the mention of David's name 5 times. And this is what I would like to talk about, because it's this which, of all the things in this chapter, and I've covered many things in the last 30 or 40 minutes, this is something that really just, I had to just take a second look. Okay, twice the mention is of the city of David. And you can't avoid that because that's where they were. They're traveling around, they're going down by the steps. His tomb was there. You cannot avoid that. You cannot avoid the fact that King David was the greatest man. He's called a man after God's own heart. But in other places where he's mentioned the 3 other references, that's what got me to thinking. In reality, all of this setup is very much patterned after what happened in 1 Chronicles 23 through the close of 1 Chronicles 29, which ends the book of Chronicles, which is this. It says that David was old. He had already set his sight that Solomon would be king and replace him, and it seems as though there was a commingling of the two for a time. 1 Chronicles 29 closes with the death of David. But in that period, David sets out a structure, and that structure in a microcosm is repeated here. If you want to turn with me to 1 Chronicles 23, and I'll walk you through an idea of something, and then we'll come back to Nehemiah for me to close. But in 1 Chronicles 23, first of all, in this chapter, David will change the age from 30 years, where it starts in 23:3, of the Levites being able to serve. He's going to lower that to the age of 20. And he assigns them. And if you take a look, you'll see how staggering this is. There are 38,000 of these. This is in David's day. There were 38,000 of these men. These are the Levites and their duties, 38,000 of them. 24,000 of the 38,000, verse 4, were to set forward the work of the house of the Lord. 6,000 were officers and judges. 4,000 were gatekeepers, and 4,000 praised the Lord with instruments, the King James says, which I made. No, which David provided, which he made available to them. And here's where David divides the courses and redistributes essentially the work that will be done. And if you keep going with me, you'll see that in verse 26 of the 23rd chapter, let me go back to the 25th verse. For David said, "The Lord God of Israel hath given rest unto his people, that they may dwell in Jerusalem forever." Unbeknownst to David, after the death of his son, the kingdom would be torn apart into pieces. And unbeknownst to him, we're talking about a couple of hundred years by the time you get to Nehemiah. That's what's so staggering, that all of this is being said without knowing what is going to happen with Solomon and at the death of Solomon. So the aged David is giving these instructions. He says, and also, verse 26, unto the Levites, they shall no more carry the tabernacle, nor any vessel for its service thereof. And For by the last words of David, the Levites were numbered from 20 years old and above. That means they started to work now at the age of 20 and up. And if you read through this chapter at your own leisure, you'll find that they did have many other liturgical, ministerial duties. But preeminently, these people had the responsibility of giving praise day and night. That was their part of their duty. Now, to stand every morning to thank and to praise the Lord, and likewise at even, day and night. Chapter 24 begins the divisions of the priest, of which I just said I mentioned Abijah. If you are curious to know where he occurs in this, he's in the 10th verse. And then the 25th chapter goes back to the temple musicians and their duties. The influence of David on Nehemiah's day, what David did was not law. He just implemented. He essentially saw the Levites would not be doing the functions they were previously doing, and he refocused their work to be something else. That wasn't law, but he said, this is what you'll do now. And the bulk of their work was to praise. Now, don't get me wrong. In the courses of the priests, we find people are burning incense, they're offering offerings, but they're not doing the high priestly work, and the bulk of their work is centered around praise and thanksgiving, even if it is the offerings of thanksgiving. So this is very important. What struck me, while you're still in First Chronicles, what struck me in Nehemiah is now 500 or 600 years later, they're saying according to what David did, and according to what the man of God, David the man of God, and this is what struck me from Nehemiah. They were remembering the man of God. They were not remembering David with his folly of Bathsheba and Uriah. They were not remembering David's census, which caused the wrath of God to come upon the people. They were not remembering David's folly. They were remembering David, the man of God, who reorganized the divisions of the priests and basically gave them a new assignment. And that assignment is very close to the very reason of why David had in the first place said he desired to bring the ark to Jerusalem. Do you remember the first time David sought out to bring the ark, and that terrible story of them putting the ark of God on a cart hauled by oxen, and they hit a bump or something, and one of the servants, Uzzah, reaches out his hands to stable the ark for fear that it would fall, and God knocked him dead to the ground. Do you remember that? Yes. First attempt. Then David goes back and he says, after the ark has been at the house of Obed-Edom for all these years, after all that time, he says, we need to bring the ark back. And so they set out to do it the right way, with the Levites carrying it with poles, just like they did in Moses' day. And when David is referring to that time, he says, like Moses, the man of God, doing it God's way. It's ironic that in Nehemiah, they're referring to David, the man of God, the same way. In other words, here is the man who, you can talk about all his follies, but he saw the need now. Once there was going to be this temple erected to, as I've said, repurpose the Levites, and the purpose would be focused primarily on praise and thanksgiving. And music is part of that praise, even though Asaph and his family make up that group. But if you read through these chapters in 1 Chronicles, you find at the core of everything, it was always in David's heart to bring the ark back and to bring the worship back and to bring the celebration and the praise back. And some of his psalms record that for us. The God-centeredness of David's life, forgetting all of the follies. This is why I tell you, if you're going to serve God, serve God. And if you're going to follow someone who's serving God, quit picking at their life and their follies, because there is no perfect servant except for Christ. Use David as an example. There's many ironies here, but these chapters represent a microcosm of what is included in Nehemiah 12. So we have what I've just described as the organization in chapter 24 of the priests. And then we have more temple workers and their divisions, chapter 26. All of the organization, you'll find the Levites are tucked into almost every single crevice of these verses. And then finally, in the last chapters, you have the offerings for the temple, and it's abundant. It's this incredible amount of offering being poured out. The amounts, if you had to calculate them by today's values, I don't even know what they would come up to. But essentially, these chapters, it's almost as though the writer, I said, I don't know who wrote this chapter, or at least the fragmented part of this chapter, had in mind to let us know that the Levites had been given a new assignment. So when you start reading, you recognize the reason why they had to seek out the Levites to bring them back is their chief assignment was to give thanks and praise. That was their chief assignment. Can you imagine that being your chief assignment in life, to give thanks and praise? Please don't say no, because that's what we're supposed to be. We are those Levites, exactly just like that, to walk around, give thanks and praise. And we don't need a special day. We have a dedication all year long. Not just one day, not one day a week, not 1 hour, but all the time. So I ask you to turn back with me briefly back into Nehemiah 12 to just take a look at these, because it will sum up the gist of what I wanted to glean out of this. Even though we've covered a massive amount of territory, there's one thing I want to say which could be probably the best thing said out of this chapter. They remembered the man of God. The people in Nehemiah's day, the men of God, remembered the man of God. Now, it couldn't happen a better way. I did not time this way. I started working in this book this week, and it came to me. I want to preach this for a purpose. I want to deliver this for a purpose, not only to tell of what's inside the chapter, but to say it's important for us to never forget the men and women of God. It's important for us to remember that just like David did something a little bit different, he repurposed. He did something that was slightly different from its original purpose, but its purpose actually took hold to bring us into the New Testament times. That ordering of the course of the priests of the order gave us the opening to be able to date the birth of Christ and John the Baptist. So what he did, even though he turned it a little bit, was not completely abandoning God's way. In fact, God was in it to order it just that way. So when these people, these great men of God, reference David, the man of God in verse 24, and the man of God with the musical instruments in verse 36, and then you've got again in former days, the days of David and Asaph, with the praise that was present there. The mention this many times in one chapter of the man of God, even though they should have been completely focused, by the way, on the dedication, the temple, all the things that were going on, and yet they referenced David, the man of God. And why? Because David essentially is the one who, of all the people, we can talk about all the different things that happened, he brought the focus of God back front and center, and even if it was only for a time. As I said, Saul, who was the first king, he didn't care. When the evil spirit came upon him, he was no longer interested in what God may have wanted. We've got David, and then Solomon, his son, who very clearly in Chronicles it says, if your son will follow these things and these ways, and we know that he didn't. He prayed for wisdom, and I'm not sure what part of wisdom he was using in his choices that he made. Nevertheless, after the kingdoms divided, this is what's so remarkable. The Levites were still carrying out their functions. They were carrying out their functions pretty much based on what had been organized by David. And if you read in Kings, with the division of Israel and Judah and the tearing away, if you will, the kingdom being rent, it becomes very obvious that it became harder and harder as there were different kings that ruled. Some kings were good and some kings were not so good. It became more difficult for the Levites to carry out that purpose. I'm reminded of at least one of the kings in Hezekiah's day, for example. They tried to come back to the very practice that they had started out with, but with all of these different kings and different situations, and the last one, who was evil, being carried away, Zedekiah. Do you really think the people had a memory of what it was to be able to know what the Levites did? And the key to that is they did. In Psalm 137, the people who are in captivity are asked if they will sing a song. It tells you something about the nature. They weren't just saying, hey, come on, sing a song and be happy. It tells you about the nature of the people who ministered. They did know this. And I think it's a highlight, an accomplishment to David, the man of God, who, despite all these other things, followed exactly what God wanted him to do and set the courses that bring us into the New Testament. Had that not been done, we may not have or had access to the information that lets us stand so firmly on the things that were set up from those courses of the priests. Now, when I started working on the sermon, I said, this should be something that we look at as remembering the men of God, remembering the man of God. And today I want us to be the people of God, remembering the man of God, because I think Dr. Scott's ministry had a lot of different turns in it, a lot of different and unique ways, kind of veering off from the old and new, stepping from, the black and white universe into the satellite universe, so many different things that we could use the word, which has been highly overused, and probably it's almost to the point of enough when we use the word pioneer. But he did change the course very much for ministry. And I don't want to say that in a negative way. I want to say it exactly the way that I see David doing it. Dr. Scott changed the course in his vision for spreading the gospel. Yes, there were other folks who established radio stations, who were preaching the gospel on radio a long time, I think probably before Dr. Scott ever got here. But in terms of the vision that he had for taking the gospel to the world, it was a change in direction. And I don't want this church, some of you are newer here and you didn't have the luxury of hearing Dr. Scott. I don't want you to forget, so I'll be like those in Nehemiah's day who were reminding those maybe who were born in captivity about the great man of God, David, who did many great things. And I'm not interested, just like these, they didn't catalog David's follies. They didn't catalog his sins. They didn't catalog the things that are dismal. I take it as a great responsibility when we talk about Dr. Scott's teaching ministry to make sure that Dr. Scott is remembered first and foremost as the greatest Bible teacher of this age. And a lot of people would like Dr. Scott to be remembered as someone who dabbled over here, or he taught in these other things, but he was a Bible teacher and a pastor who cared more about his church and more about your eternal destiny probably than anything else and any other person I've ever encountered in my life. So it's a good time to say, just like David, I want the people of God today to remember the man of God. And for some of you who didn't have the luxury and the honor and the privilege of being around that man of God, I want you to know from my mouth, because there are many people out there who pervert somebody's memory. And I know I was married to the man. What you saw in front of you was exactly what he was in private. He wasn't a hypocrite. He was a great man of God. It was my biggest thing that when I knew that Dr. Scott, probably within a week or two, had God not miraculously entered in and done a miracle, it looked like Dr. Scott's life was just about coming to an end. And I took if you want to call it the bull by the horns, I was busy releasing. We had prepared a press release because I knew that the heathen world out there, I knew that the worldly people out there, I knew that the people that didn't know him or never listened to him would sling as much stuff into his obituary as they humanly could. I knew that was going to happen. I anticipated it. The day before it was in the Times, it was leaked out by the Associated Press. That came from me. I did that because I was earnestly hoping that if I was the first one to the press, I could tell people, you have it all wrong. You didn't know the man. You only see the caricature of what your evil and pernicious mind would like to see. You only think what you know, but you didn't spend the time to actually get to know the man. I did. And the bulk of everything that could ever be said about him, the things that he lamented when people said he never wanted to be called a televangelist. He thought that was an offensive word. What do you think the first word in his obituary was written by the press? Televangelist. So it matters to me the way we remember the people of God. There are plenty of people out there who say malicious things about me. I've told you I don't care. I don't have children or a husband. At this point, I'm talking about people alive, that I have to worry about the pain and the grief that it causes them, but I know it causes you grief. I know it hurts many of you when you hear people saying things about me, but that doesn't matter. You know me and what I stand for, and that's what matters. And when I say remembering the man of God, I know what Dr. Scott stood for. Just like these people here in Nehemiah's book, they didn't say, oh, but you know what? David had a loose life. He was a little bit of a libertine. We can't have that in here because we want to make sure that we're restoring religion the way we want it remembered. They put out exactly what information was needed according to the man of God. And they did this according to the man of God, and the worship and the praise and the courses of the priest according to the man of God. And that man of God was obviously led by God, because this is what God wanted us to have put in front of our faces, to be able to say, when people argue about December 25th, and they argue about John the Baptist, and they argue about all these different facts, it's right here if you'll take the chance and the opportunity to look. It's right here, according to the man of God, and according to the great men of God, and according to the woman who's standing right here before God. So when I say to you, all of the information in this chapter is very important. It's a great scene, and it's a great spectacle, but all of this comes back to remembering the man of God. David is the one we're talking about. I just thought I would dovetail on that and tell you, it's important that each individual person do their part. The world has its ability to tear down, to cast doubt, to say the things that are most hurtful to somebody who you have placed your trust in. And I said, first, let me say this about Dr. Scott. I was married to him. And that crazy personality, what I say is crazy, is irresistible, but it was authentically Dr. Gene Scott. He wasn't trying to be some whitewashed, white-suited, pseudo, whatever. He was his own man. His cigar smoking or his hat wearing or even his language at times, that was him. That was a man being used of God, not saying, I have to be somebody else to be used of God, but this is who I am. God works through me, and this is the vessel that he chose. So when we remember the man of God, I'm not telling you whitewash and change, and I'm telling you, remember the things that are the most important and the most impactful, that for our time, for the body of Christ, I guarantee you, if I went out in the street and asked any 20 people that I met, if they understand what Dr. Gene Scott did for the churches in this state, and by virtue of doing what he did in this state, what he did for the churches in America, and I guarantee you, probably I cannot find one person out there that would remember that. But it was his work in sitting in Senator Petrus's office that got the Petrus bill passed, that kept the Attorney General out of the churches and basically said, you keep your hands off, you're not allowed in. There were other things that happened with the passing of that bill, but my point is, it's too much for me to see so many people out there that say they remember Dr. Scott, and all they're doing is mudslinging. They're calling up things that are irrelevant to the contributions that this man made to the body of Christ. So I want you today, and I don't want it just for one day, I want it to be something that you understand resonates with me. It's my responsibility, just like these people in this day, to remember the man of God and to make sure that his memory is a lasting memory, which is why I thank God for all the volunteers who have helped with the pulpit. I know they're now working, there's a question mark there, but they're working on number 10. And all the people who have helped over the years to try and permanize and digitize and do all the things we're doing, that's remembering the man of God every day. Now, I want you to leave here today recognizing something. This chapter is not only important for what these people saw in their day. We're talking 500 to 600 years after David is dead. His influence on these people's lives well after that and after captivity. My prayer is that the life of Dr. Gene Scott, for however long this earth exists, whatever time that is, people will still be influenced by his work and his message. Not the things that people would like to talk about, which are, I call these auxiliary things, that big deal, but what he stood for. You know what he stood for? He stood for coming to a church that was on the verge of bankruptcy with 105 members, whatever he said when he came here. The church had already been raped and pilfered by some of the largest names in Christendom that went off to do their own thing, leaving him with the responsibility and the debt, and a church that had no faith. I'm looking at a much smaller church today than the church that he pastored when he was alive, but I'm looking at people who understand the life of faith is not deciding whether you like my hair or my makeup or whether you liked his cigar or his hats. It's recognizing exactly what Jesus said in John 17. This is life eternal, that they may know thee. And you can only get to know God by spending time in his word and even opening up these passages which seem dry and meaningless, but in fact give you the real understanding that inside every single book of the Bible, you'll find kernels of instruction. You'll find pieces of information that link old and new. If somebody says, refute for me the proof of Jesus Christ, I'll take you there. I've got more than just this, but that begins right there. That all of this has meaning, and all of this, by the way, was what the man of God, David, stood for, and what my late husband, the man of God, Dr. Gene Scott, stood for. And praise be to God, it's what I stand for too. So I pray this day you remember the man of God, the men of God, and most importantly, you remember that God so carefully places these treasures in our hands because he cares for us. This church has been the recipient of a great blessing through 30 years ministry of Dr. Scott. I pray that the Lord will give me that time. Maybe I'll catch up to be just a little bit of dirt under his fingernails in the things that I present to you, but I know one thing. That man of God will never be forgotten. That's my message. I'm Pastor Melissa Scott, pastor of Faith Center, Glendale, California. I teach every Sunday morning at 11 a.m. If you'd like to attend services with us, simply call the 800 number, that is 800-338-3030, to join us. If you'd like to watch, listen, and learn 24 hours a day, simply log on to our website at www.pastormelissascott.com.